Washington D.C. is the capital of the United States of America and the abbreviation D.C. stands for District of Columbia. It's named after an old poetic name, Columbia, that is derivative of Columbus. It has a size of around 460 square kilometers and consists for 10% out of water and for 90% out of land.
The current location of Washington D.C. is in the state Columbia at the Potomac River, which is between the states of Maryland and Virginia. However, the decision to place the capital of the United States here was a hard one.
The United States needed a capital after the American War of Independence. First of all was New York a temporary capital from 1783 till 1790. After that there was Philadelphia, the second capital from 1790 till 1800. There was a compromise needed for the permanent capital of the United States. In the Constitution was written that the capital can be a part of an existing state and that the capital can be bigger than 25 square kilometers.
After a long period of doubt, decided Alexander Hamilton from the north of the USA and Thomas Jefferson from the south of the USA that the capital needed to be placed at the Potomac River. George Washington decided the exact location of the city. In 1790 decided the Act of Residence that the capital would be built in ceded land from the states of Virginia and Maryland. In 1791 was decided that the state was named the District of Columbia and that the capital was named Washington, after the first President of the United States of America.
The Frenchman Pierre Laval was appointed to design a new capital. He presented his design on August 19 in 1791. The city got a network of streets that lead in north-south and east-west direction with the diagonal leading avenues. On the intersections of the avenues were big roundabouts planned, which would honor famous Americans from the USA. This network of streets is now the famous grid structure, which we saw before in the Bangster.
Washington D.C. grew slowly in the first decennia after the founding. Parts of the city were wetlands, so it was hard to build on these lands. The District of Columbia had a hard time to develop the city in economic and demographic aspects. The location of the capital was thereby also a disaster. The British Marine could easily sail over the Potomac River and capture the city in the War of 1812. After this, British troops burned down parts of the city and destroyed government buildings, such as the White House and the Capitol.
The population of the city grew barely between 1800 and 1860, but the American Civil War of 1861 caused an influx of troops in the city, which had to protect the city and the government buildings. In April 1862 was the slavery abolished in the city, which brought a positive development for the capital. Many forts were built around the city in the war, which still can be seen nowadays.
The District of Columbia existed out of many places at first. Georgetown and Washington were different cities, and there was a county of Washington. The area seemed hard to control, so a law was passed in 1871 which decided that all of the areas in the District of Columbia were merged under one name, the city of Washington, D.C. The borders of the city were since then the same as the borders of the state of the District of Columbia.
Most of the beautiful buildings were built after 1888. In this year the Washington Monument was built and after this followed a period of beautification of the city. Many monuments and museums were founded in this period. The number of residents decreased in 1960 because of the race riots. The city had more than 800,000 residents in the 60s. It was the 9th biggest city in the country. In the beginning of the 21st century, has the city less than 600,000 residents. It is now the 24th biggest city in the country.
However, the District of Columbia has not increased in population. The metropolitan region of Baltimore and Washington has grown into an area of almost 7.5 million residents and is number 29 on the world list of most populated urban areas. Nowadays are the most important streets in Washington the Pennsylvania Avenue, which the White House with the Capitol connects, the Constitution Avenue, which leads across the north-south of the capital and parallel at the National Mall, and the Independence Avenue, which is parallel at the south of the National Mall. The triangle that is formed by the Pennsylvania Avenue, the Constitution Avenue, and the 14th Street is called the Federal Triangle.
There is a Department of Parks and Recreation founded in Washington D.C. This department controls all of the parks and other leisure places in the city. There are a lot of parks and green areas in Washington D.C. Two of the most famous parks are the Hillwood Gardens and the Franciscan Monastery Gardens. Of course is the National Mall Strip, a big green spot and a famous leisure place in the middle of Washington D.C.
Another big green spot in the state is the United States National Arboretum and Anacostia Park. This is a park and a tree collection together. It has a size of around 2 square kilometers big. Probably the biggest green spot in Washington is the Rock Green Park. It is around 8 square kilometers big and is placed in the northeast of Washington.
Washington D.C. lays in the middle of a very populous and densely built area. There are many cities around the capital such as Baltimore, Alexandria, Arlington, Springfield, Rockville, Reston, Waldorf, Laurel, etc. etc. As said before, the metropolitan region of Baltimore and Washington D.C. is the 9th most populous area in the world. There is a density of around 4,000 inhabitants per square kilometers, which is almost the same as in Munich in Germany.
The districts of Washington D.C. contains out of the famous grid structure. The districts are almost over the entire city. Only in the northwest and in the northeast are some places left for nature. There is not much high-rise in Washington D.C. The highest construction in the city is the huge Memorial Tower, which is 232 meters high, followed by the Washington Monument, which is 169 meters high. The highest real building is a basilica and is 100 meters high. Canberra is the capital of Australia. It is placed in the state of the Australian Capital Territory. The city is placed in the northern part of this state, between the southwest of Sydney and the northeast of Melbourne. The first Europeans came to the current place of Canberra in 1820 to keep many sheep.
It was a hard decision to decide the location of the capital, just like it was for the United States of America. Here was also a compromise needed. The two biggest cities of Australia, Melbourne and Sydney, both wanted to be the capital. So they decided to place the official capital of Australia in the middle of those two cities in 1908. They called the city Canberra, what in Inuktitut, an Aboriginal language, meeting place means.
The city is the biggest Australian city that is not connected to the sea. It is also the 6th biggest city of Australia. Although the city is not connected with the sea, the Australian law prescribes that the capital needs to be accessible through the sea. So they cheated and decided that the Jervis Bay Territorium in the south of New South Wales needed to be a part of the Australian capital. The Jervis Bay Territorium is about 3 hours driving from Canberra.
The American urbanist Burley Griffin originally designed Canberra. He got a job because he won an international competition. The city consists out of a center where most of the government's buildings and buildings of other departments are placed. Around the city center are again streets designed through a grid structure. But this is a smaller grid structure than the one we saw in Washington D.C. An important part of the design of Burley Griffin is the lake Burley Griffin, which is named after himself. This is a decorative reservoir in the river the Molonglo in the middle of the city. Burley Griffin designed a spacious garden city with wide streets and a lot of parks.
The National Triangle is referred as the Parliamentary Triangle. It connects the most significant buildings, such as the Parliament House, the seat of the government, the Defence Headquarters, which is called Brussels, and the City Hill, which represents the civilian part of Canberra. Burley Griffin planned the city around two axes that converge in the center of the National Triangle. The land axis connects Mount Ainslie, Capitol Hill and Red Hill and extends off towards Mount Bimbury, the Australian Capital Territory's highest mountain. The water axis runs at right angles to the land axis along the length of Lake Burley Griffin.
The southern shore of Lake Burley Griffin intersects the National Triangle, forming a smaller triangle known as the Parliamentary Zone, bounded by Kings and Commonwealth Avenues. Nowadays, Canberra consists out of a population of 400,000 people in an area of 815 square kilometers. So there are 200,000 people less in an area 2 times bigger than Washington D.C.
We limit ourselves to the city of Canberra only, because the Australian Capital Territory is far bigger than the city only. This is different in the USA, where the capital and the state have the same size. There are less parks in Canberra than in Washington D.C, but Canberra has more green around the city and the city is not surrounded by other cities. The biggest parks are the Western Park, the Stirling Park and the Red Hill Nature Park, which both lay close by the center.
Of course, is the Parliamentary Triangle also in Canberra a big green spot for leisure. There are a variety of parks in this green spot and the triangle is crossed by the Lake Burley Griffin. As said before, this lake is created and it's an important green hub in the city. There are 2 mountains in the city. The first is Black Mountain and lays in the west of the city. The second one is Mount Majura and lays in the opposite of the Black Mountain in the east of the city. These 2 mountains are a kind of nature border of the capital.
However, there are not a lot of big parks in Canberra, but there are 2 big forests nearby the city. These are the Cowan Pine Forest and the Uriara State Forest. Both of these forests are reachable with a 45-minute drive.
In contrast with Washington D.C, is Canberra not surrounded by different cities. There are some small villages in the neighborhood, but even the closest are a half-hour drive away. There are a lot of vast forests, there are mountains, a lot of farmlands and even a vast lake, Lake George, which has almost the same size as the city. The density in Canberra is 430 inhabitants per square kilometers, which is 10 times less than the density in Washington D.C. But it is the same as in Broek en Waterland in the Netherlands.
Just like Washington D.C. has Canberra not much high-rise. The highest construction in Canberra is the Parliament House. On top of the Parliament is a construction placed where an Australian flag is attached to. This construction is 107 meters high. The highest real building in Canberra is the Lovett Tower, which is 93 meters high. This building is followed by the Sentinel Apartments, which are 62 meters high.
There are a lot of similarities between Canberra and Washington D.C, but there are also a lot of differences. The Australian capital Canberra has much in common with the capital of the USA, Washington D.C. In both cases, the location was agreed as a compromise between 2 opposing interests, Sydney and Melbourne in the Australian case, Maryland and Virginia in the American one. Perhaps this is a part of why the 2 cities have such a similar feel. They are both artificial constructs built on land that would quite likely otherwise be largely uninhabited by humans.
The most obvious comparison to draw is the layout of the cities, focused on a central avenue with key buildings at either end. In Washington, the capital is at one end of the National Mall, a broad grass boulevard that stretches in a straight line from the Capitol Hill at one end to the Washington Memorial at the other end. In Canberra, a much longer boulevard stretches from the Parliament House at the top of Capitol Hill to the Australian War Memorial. Unlike Washington, the Australian War Memorial is on a hill, and the boulevard is interrupted by a lake.
Both cities are located near water. In Washington D.C, the water flows at the border of the city, and in Canberra, the water is in the middle of the city. In both cities is the water an important green factor, so blue is green in both of the cities. The history of Washington D.C. is far longer and more complicated than the one of Canberra. Though there are some similarities, both countries were under control of the United Kingdom and both countries had a hard time to decide where to place the capital, though Australia had to make the decision later.
There are a lot of differences between the nature and building areas of the cities. Washington D.C. has more buildings, more people, and a far bigger density. Canberra has more nature and the people have more space. The city is also not surrounded by other cities and has some grid structure, but far less than Washington D.C. Though there are big differences, there are some similarities. They both have water, they are both designed from the ground up, and they are both developed around a central green strip.